computer. So thanks very much, Baroness Sal, for joining UE Pairs on what is a busy period for you in the House of Lords. For those who don't know who you are, would you like to explain a little bit about yourself and what your job entails and what you've been up to over the last few years, maybe?
I've been a member of the House of Lords for the last 10 years, in fact, 10 years and 1 month, almost to the day. Before that, I had 20 years working in higher education. I was bursar of a Cambridge college, but after that, I ran the Universities Association for the East of England, which was a sort of pro-VC level job. So I thought when I got into the Lords, I would probably spend quite a lot of my time continuing with education, because I had also been the founding chair of the Learning and Skills Council in my area. In fact, I have done virtually no education work at all since I got in. And that is one of the delights of the Lords, that you can turn your hand to anything you're interested in, but you can also be asked to become a spokesperson in a very particular area, and you build up your skills base and learn to understand it. But I jump ahead of myself. I just want to give a little bit of background about the House of Lords, if I may. And it's very much the Sal Brinton version. It's not the official history or anything else. So it's slightly liberal tinged, and bear with me. Okay. Because the House of Lords is an anachronism. I think all of us in the House of Lords would admit that. I come from a party that wants to completely change it. We want total reform. We believe a second chamber should be accountable to the people. And actually, we believe that 100% of the members of the House of Lords should be accountable to the people. Whereas quite a lot of the reforms, including those that the Lib Dems and the Conservatives were beginning to talk about during coalition, was trying to do a hybrid of keeping the best of the old with the experts who come in without a party, but having some people who are elected. And we just think that's inappropriate. The House of Lords is the second largest parliament after the General Assembly of the People's Republic of China. And it's embarrassing. That's because the Prime Minister of the day has the power to appoint anybody that they want. And the numbers have just grown and grown and grown. When I came in a decade ago, I think everyone was gulping, because we were not only larger than the House of Commons, we were over 700. We're now back to well over 850. And that's just ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. The chamber can only seat comfortably 300, 350, exactly the same as the House of Commons. So you can't all go in on a really important day. You can cram and stand around the edges, but you can't participate in the way that was ever intended. But the other big anachronism is the tradition, which often, sadly, gets in the way of one of the things that we're excellent at, which is challenge and scrutinizing the government of the day. So my tour of the House of Lords, when I take people into the chamber, I don't ask them to look at all the gold and red around us, because it is very gold and very red. In fact, the grandson of a friend of mine who has been in the House a bit longer than me, when he went in, he came out, he was 7, and he said, "I've never seen so much gold, Grandpa, in my life." You really are in this extraordinary environment where every sense is assailed by your position in the hierarchy. And I'm uncomfortable with that, because I don't think that sign of wealth through red, which was a colour that only the nobility were allowed to use traditionally in our country, and everything gold or brass coloured so it looks gold, sends out quite the right message about what we're doing. Now, I get people to look up, because above us in the chamber are statues of all the main signatories to the original Magna Carta. They tower over us. And what's more, all the barons, not the 2 archbishops, all the barons glower. They are very fierce in full medieval armour, and they are there to remind us why we are there. We are a house of peers. We have to check the power of the monarchy. And in the 21st century, we're also there to check the power of the government via the Commons and those ministers. And I say that because often we get caught up in the history in a way which personally I find difficult. I mean, there are times when it's very funny. In the run-up to the anniversary of Magna Carta in 2015, there was, I jest not, a serious debate about whether we should spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on bringing in scaffolding in order to dust down those barons so they'd be nice and bright and clean for the anniversary. We also address each other in a very outdated way. It's not quite Tudor and Stuart era, but unlike the Commons, who have begun to relax those rules, if you're talking to someone who is a retired judge, you don't just say Lord X, you say the noble and the learned Lord X. And if somebody has been above a certain level in the military, you say the noble and the gallant Lord, and it usually is Lord X. And as a newcomer coming in, all this procedure and protocol, I mean, there's no logic to it. You just have to learn who people are. And when you're talking about 800 members, that's an awful lot of people to learn about. So that's perhaps the anachronistic side. So what is it that we're there for, which I think we do well? And that is scrutiny and challenge. When we were members of the EU, it was the Lords that had the 5 big committees that looked at everything that was being passed, looked at in the Parliament and indeed in the Commission as well, and then made reports back to both Houses of Parliament. And that was a job they did extremely well. But it's much more than that. We take considerably more time than the MPs do to look at the detail of bills. It really is about going through bills on a minute detail by minute detail. So just after I came in, there was a big bill about schools called the Children and Families Bill. The Commons, when they met, had, I think it was 4 days at committee. We had 15. And when I say day, that's starting at about 3 in the afternoon and going on till 10 p.m. with a very brief break for a meal at some point early evening. And series of amendments. I'm working on the domestic abuse bill at the moment, as Sadie knows. I think we had 6 days in committee with that, and it looks like we're going to do 3 to 4 on report. Commons, 1 day, perhaps 2, not much more. And that's because they just don't have the capacity to do it. So our function as a second chamber is very much to do that detailed work. And when we vote, we don't vote perhaps as often as they do in the Commons. We used to say that. We seem to be voting more at the moment. But when we do, it's because we think we can win a vote. So when the Prime Minister complains that those pesky Lords have won a vote again, actually, we take soundings to find out whether we think we're going to be successful. And for those of you who know about the way the Commons works, we have exactly the same stages in a bill that have to be gone through. Anything that we pass goes back to the Commons and then has to come back to us again. And that's usually where we've made gains. We may also make some losses. But the big thing that you can do is, if you are able to get cross-party support, is to persuade the minister to give you some benefit, perhaps not everything you want, but some benefits. So I thought it might be helpful just to explain about the first piece of work I did from an idea right the way through to it becoming law within the first 3 years of me joining. And for this, I just need to give you a very brief bit of background. I stood for Parliament in Watford, which I've lived in for 15 years. And the first time I stood, we started to notice that harassment and criminal damage was happening to myself, some of our councillors and supporters, which slowly over the next couple of years escalated into serious criminal damage, into poison pen letters, and into what nowadays would be called stalking. And it was only when I went to the police with a spreadsheet of over 100 issues that they started to take it seriously. And then they managed to get a profiler in who was getting very, very worried about the escalation of the activity, who said, actually, this is about to become violence against the person, no longer against the property. They found the person. We had known for years who it was. We had evidence, but the police thought it was just a political spat. When he was caught, he pleaded guilty. He was a political opponent of mine. He was actually another candidate for standing for Westminster in Parliament. But his behaviour was at that point classified as harassment, the same harassment as if you have an argument with your neighbour about the height of the hedge. and the maximum sentence was up to 6 months in prison. But what this man had done crossed that border into fixated behaviour and stalking. But there wasn't a separate law for stalking at all. So when I came in, within about a week of coming in, I had a little deputation of people from who are interested in justice matters, including the now Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, so cross-party. It's very important these things are cross-party, saying, would I join an inquiry into the problems with the current harassment laws on stalking? Now, 95% of stalking is about a former or a former partner. So my case was unusual in that respect. But what was not unusual was the behaviour and the consequences, both for the perpetrator and for myself and my family. My 14-year-old foster son had to be taught to pick up the post when it came through the door by using the police plastic gloves that we'd been left. So the impact on children was significant. And when I've talked to victims of stalking, the children have been horrifically abused, emotionally, coercively controlled, often by the stalkers as well. So we had an inquiry, cross-party inquiry, in the form of an all-party group. We sent the results of that to the then Justice Secretary. And then there was a bill that was a Home Office bill with some justice elements in it. And I laid down amendments in the House of Lords about a new stalking law. And it took us from that first amendment going down to it being passed into law, actually only about a year. Normally, it takes private members' bills which fail, repeated amendments being laid down, but we just happened to get it at the right time, and we had the right evidence from the lobby groups, Women's Aid, Refuge, people who had been victims of stalking. And we were able to use the press and TV to be able to tell those stories, because one of the other problems about stalkers is that far too many end up actually murdering their victims. So it then becomes a problem for the justice system if you don't stop them early enough. And it was quite extraordinary. And afterwards, the minister in the Lords and one of my colleagues said, now you mustn't think this happens every time. It really doesn't. And it doesn't. But what I do know is that if you have one small niche thing that you can demonstrate and provide the evidence for and get support cross-party and start to persuade a minister that there is a problem that needs to be rectified, you are far more likely to have success if you're in the Lords, because you've got the time to be able to do it. Those are the basic rules. So I'm going to pause now. I've sort of rattled through a bit of legislation, how we do it. I've rattled through a bit about the history, and I'm happy to take any questions in any area you like.
Well, that was very interesting to say. Even longer I've been in politics, I didn't know half of that. So that was very interesting. So one question I do have, I found out a lot about the domestic abuse bill from members of the party like Christine Jardine. So like, how have you been working with fellow MPs like on this matter? Do you like meet with them, gather their information to take it to the Lords, or how does that all work?
So each party does it slightly differently. My party has set up essentially backbench committees that mimic the work of select committees, so by department, where you've got the Commons spokesperson and the Lord spokesperson jointly chairing it. And then any MP or any peer who is interested in that particular area is invited to come along. And on the domestic abuse bill, in the run up to that, I'm not on the because I'm health spokesperson, health and social care spokes, I'm not on the justice team and the homes team on a regular basis. But I'd alerted them that because I've currently got a private members bill sitting in the sidelines on changing the victims code into a victims law, which the government has said for 5 years it's going to do, and it hasn't, that there would be amendments I'd want to put down on this bill. And at that point, I became a backbencher member of that team. And we work very closely with MPs, because obviously as bills bat back and forth between both houses, you need to be able to say the same things.
Right, that is quite an interesting explanation. I will admit. So I'm going to pass it on to Megan or Ryan now for one of their questions. We have got quite a few questions to get through. So whichever one of you wants to take it away first, feel free.
Hiya, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Megan. I'm the Vice President of the Politics and IR Society. I'm also a first year student of Politics and International Relations. So my question is, obviously you mentioned Women's Aid and various other women's charities. I just wondered if you do much like charity work alongside your politics or any other kind of thing outside of that?
I have done. At the moment, I haven't, partly because pandemic. I was a trustee at UNICEF for 6 years, which finished just before the pandemic started. And I have always tried to have one or two charity or other interest organisations that I've been a member of, and in some cases been lucky enough to chair. I have to say that one of the problems of being a minor party in the House of Lords is you don't get lots of staff. So again, right, I must slay some other myths, but that means that as health and social care spokesperson, I have to do a lot of my background research myself. I don't have people to write my speeches. I've got some help, clerical help, with calling meetings of my team, which is about 14 in the Lords. But it's absolutely vital. And as we come out of pandemic and life starts to return to normal, I'll be thinking about what I'm going to do next in the charitable sector.
Thank you.
Great,
And sorry,
right.
I should say, I'm really sorry, I should say, because it's just because I'm disabled, I do a lot of work with disabled charities, but I do that much more because of my lived experience than I do as a member of the House of Lords.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Hi. You go on, Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm on the committee for the Politics and International Relations Society, and like Meg, I'm a first year politics student. Thank you for being here. It's lovely to get input from kind of directly in the heart of legislation. You've spoken a lot about kind of working on issues that are close to you and that you have personal experience with, and you've talked about like a bunch of different issues that are really, really important. I wondered if you had any pieces, maybe some that you'd already mentioned, that are like your kind of proudest bills that you've worked on.
Well, I think the Stalking Law reform's absolutely up there. The Children and Families Act was as well, because this comes back to my interest in disability. I worked with a coalition of 14 children's disability charities to get something into legislation in ensuring that schools take seriously medical conditions in children. We had ridiculous reports from charity cancer charity organisations saying that there were children on chemo where schools were saying you can't do your GCSEs because you can't do the homework, rather than working with the student to try and give them the support that they needed. One report of a head teacher saying that they didn't believe in ME, and therefore a child who actually had a letter from the consultant saying they should do no sport was disciplined because they weren't doing any sport. So for the first time ever in the Department for Education, there is a chapter in a bill that talks about what schools must not do. It talks about the support they must give, but it also says, you may not ban children with disabilities from going on days out. You have to make adjustments to make sure that it can happen for them. You may not take off their inhalers off them. We had one horror story of a primary school in Scotland that took asthma inhalers off children and locked them in the cupboard in the classroom of the teacher who was the first aider, and a little boy died. And it's that sort of thing which I would have had no idea at all. So these 14 or so charities, myself and another peer got together, and we just worked solidly behind the scenes. But my saddest thing is that the majority of parents who have children with medical conditions don't know it exists. The important bit is that the charities do. So if any parents start reporting back that they're hitting problems, then the charities can advise the parents to show them what the schools should be doing in law, because the schools often don't know as well. So I think that probably, again, it's very much personal, but very, very, very proud of that. I think some of the work I'm doing on the domestic abuse bill at the moment, where there are some, I'm trying to put this diplomatically, there are some people who want the right to create a science called parental alienation, and has been used in family courts to take a child away from a parent. And I've been fighting that because there is evidence to show that it's often a parent who has been already perpetrating some form of coercive or domestic abuse. And it's very complicated and difficult. And we've done two things, one of which we're going to be voting on tomorrow. One is to oppose making this into a science and mentioned in the bill as capital P, parental, capital A, alienation. Because we believe that if a parent is behaving very badly and telling their children that they shouldn't love, be with the other parent, actually that's coercive control. So it's covered already by the bill. But we're also tomorrow voting on making sure that there's enough training for the judiciary to understand all of these different things so that they start working in a different way. It's details like that. You really think, actually, that's going to affect somebody's life. That becomes really important. And I'm a Lib Dem, I'm a Remainer, and myself, my colleagues, mainly my colleagues, have been absolutely fighting tooth and nail over the years, first of all, for us to stay in, and more recently to make sure that we protected our interests having left. And that work continues. It really does continue.
Thank you for that. I've grown up with a hidden disability and with specific learning difficulties myself, and having that kind of framework within education, within schools, having people to kind of recognize those difficulties you have and to implement support is so important. And I know that firsthand. And what you're saying about the domestic abuse, that's really difficult, and I definitely keep my ear to the ground on that.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ryan, for that. So, like you, I've had hidden disabilities, and I only found out when I started university, 18 months ago. So I struggled all the way through school not knowing what my hidden disability was, and struggled all the way through my GCSEs, my A-levels. So now I'm at university. I think they're looking at the same logic that the schools have, what they have to do to help their students. I think that is a good piece of legislation. One thing that many people might not know about you is that you're involved with ALDE, which is the Alliance, if I get this right, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats in Europe. So how do you manage to balance that work with your work in the House of Lords, and what does ALDE actually do?
So if I can just go back a step, I was the president of the Liberal Democrats, and as president of the Liberal Democrats, I was heavily involved in ALDE because the Liberal Democrats are an internationalist party, European party, and I work closely with Liberal International and with ALDE. And essentially, I've been elected onto their executive committee. So my role is vice president, but I'm not the only one. And they work very closely with our colleagues in the European Parliament. But we sister parties work together. And one of the things that we've done in recent years has been to encourage women to come forward to stand in politics. And we have run cross-European training in our European Women's Academy to do that. That's been stopped. The European Parliament has banned us doing it on a partisan basis. But we have found a foundation that's been able to take over that work and do it on a non-partisan basis. But I'm afraid the world of the rules of the European Parliament are just bizarre. But we also work very closely together. So there was a scandal in the European Parliament about 5 or 6 weeks ago when one of our sister parties, MEPs, said something, a real hate statement about LGBT issues in the Parliament. And ALDE's role as the umbrella organization was to go back to his party in Estonia and to say, look, this is just absolutely unacceptable. Don't have the right to challenge it. But and in fact, the party were very good and they dealt with it. But we do work with each other to make with the parties to make sure that despite the fact we represent a lot of countries, a lot of views, even within political parties, our core values are there to be respected, and we will also help talk through and provide support for parties when they need it. So again, at the moment in lockdown, not getting around, not doing very much of that. But it's also very important for my work in the House of Lords, because every time I do some work with a sister party somewhere in Europe, I learn things. And I just think I need to constantly learn, because we're in a changing world, changing environment. Politics, for heaven's sakes, you as politics students, watching what's happening in America and in parts of Europe at the moment, there is a role for us, particularly as liberals, of trying to fight some of the very far right things that are going on, where they're completely against all the values that we stand for and we think many people take for granted.
So I just want to quickly follow on, because obviously you said that people didn't know you were the president of the party, but when unfortunately the leader then, Jo Swinson, lost her seat of East Bartonshire in the general election, you had to take over the leadership of the party for a few weeks with Sir Ed Davey. So what was that like co-leading a party with?
It was only for a very short period of time. That my term of office was about to come to an end. So actually my successor as president was joint leader with Ed for longer. I think my 5 years as president, I had 3 general elections, 3 party leader elections, and 2 chief executives of the party. And I think each of the parties during that 5-year period, everybody said it was absolutely extraordinary, because we were in such a turmoil. I don't mean the Lib Dems, I mean politics, in such a turmoil that it wasn't business as usual. I've known Jo for many years. I mean, I've known and worked for Jo since long before she became an MP, which was 2005, when she was the youngest member of Parliament. So, it was a real shock to me that she lost her seat. She was concerned about it, obviously, but to lose a leader just so soon after she had been elected was a shock. The role as leader in any situation like that is to hold the party together until the new leader is elected by the members, and that's what we did. We just had to hold everything together.
And not being biased, you did that really well. Not being biased or anything. So Megan, do you want to ask the next question? Because I've asked a couple of follow-ons.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, you've mentioned quite a few, obviously, big, quite traumatic topics throughout this conversation. And I just wondered how you managed to kind of switch off when you get back home, if you managed to switch off, because you must feel very responsible for a lot of these issues and responsible for trying to change things. So yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Well, like everybody else, social media is always a problem, and it's particularly a problem for women parliamentarians. I mean, I do try to switch off. The pandemic has been almost impossible to switch off in when your role is health and social care, and I've only recently learned to do it properly. So this time a year ago, because I'm immunosuppressed, I had already started shielding, because my consultant had said to me, I really want you to be safe, please stay at home. So long before Parliament closed down, long before Boris Johnson said the country is going into lockdown, I was already at home and working from home. And it's not good for you. It's really not good for you to work continuously, as I know many other people have. And the simple answer is, don't take your phone upstairs to your bedroom, so you're not tempted to look at things or listen to things. Make sure that you have, I read a lot. My house, I don't know if you can see any of my bookcases. No, you can't. Loads of books. Both my husband and I read an enormous amount. But during the last year in particular, I have read fiction, light fiction, that is absolutely nothing to do with work to relax.
That's good.
It's also vital for you as students too, because you need that space just to clear your head and do something else.
Definitely. Thank you. That's interesting.
That's really important. I think for people involved in politics, we read so much non-fiction all day. To have that separation of fiction, because we all have to read, so it's kind of good to have that fiction non-fiction divide. So you kind of read fiction before bed, and then you can leave the rest to the day.
Can I just turn the tables and say, can you guys leave your phones away from you? Do you leave them alone or not?
No, because I live in a flat, so it's actually impossible to leave it alone.
This is my whole room.
Yeah,
I'd
I know.
only be a couple meters away.
And that's why I'm asking, because believe me, I know. Sorry, I interrupted.
That's okay. You carry on, Brian. I'll go on our
Fine.
next question.
I was curious personally, because you were given your life peerage in 2011. I was just curious if you'd kind of always intended, if that was always kind of your goal, if you'd always intended that as like you always wanted to get into politics, and if not, kind of what did you kind of used to aspire for?
So I think if you had asked me in my 20s, would I go into politics, I'd have said no, but I do come from a political family. My father was a Tory MP for some years, but the most important influence on my early life was my cousin, Mary Stocks, who was one of the early Labour peers. She was an influence on my life, not because I knew that or understood it, but she lived around the corner from us and she used to come for Sunday dinner. And she was the only person who could argue my father off the table. She was amazing. And I knew that she had an important job. She was head of what was Westfield College and is now QMC in London. But she was a suffragist. I didn't even know that. I knew that I thought she was a suffragette, but she wasn't. She was a suffragist. And the example of her life, because of what she said to me, I mean, when I was 8, 9, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And she just said, you can do it. If you set your mind to it, you can do it. You just need to be clear about the rules. And on a few occasions later on in her life, she always asked me what my ambitions were. So I was very aware of that political influence. My father and I argued about politics again around the table a few years later when I was at my secondary school, and that's why I joined the Liberals. I was out marching some of the anti-apartheid marches. I opposed the death penalty, and at that point I think there were threats that it might be brought back. It had fairly only recently been banned, and I was absolutely passionate about our role in what became the European community. So I joined the Liberals in 74 in the run-up to the referendum in 75. But at that point I worked at the BBC and I worked in production, and you were not allowed to be political. So I was a member of the party but didn't do anything else. And slowly, after I started to have my family, I was drawn in, and then I got the bug. And once I got the bug, I'm afraid that was it. So I became a councillor. The next day I became a cabinet member because we ended up in control with Labour of Cambridge County Council. I suddenly, one day old as a councillor, became chair of education. And then I became a candidate for Parliament. Didn't win again. And I thought, right, that's it. I'll just go on and focus on my university job. And 3 days after the 2010 election, the phone went, my daughter picked it up and she said, Mum, it's 10 Downing Street. Handed over. And it was Nick Clegg, and I was being offered a peerage. But unlike some of the other people coming in, Nick, when he asked people to go in as part of the Lib Dem team, said, we don't want people who aren't going to work. I want you to commit to being there. I don't want you to have lots of jobs and money coming in from elsewhere, because we want to make sure our team is firing on all cylinders. And that was the basis on which I went in.
That's wonderful. That's so lovely that you had such a strong inspiration.
Yeah. Mary was quite extraordinary. She wrote a couple of autobiographies, but in one of them she describes Emily Wilding Davison's funeral, and she couldn't get close. She could see the cortege. She reckoned there were about 15,000 people on the Euston Road. It's just the most extraordinary, breathtaking account. And this was a woman who wasn't a suffragette. She was a suffragist. She always used to say that she would have been a suffragette if she hadn't come from a middle-class family, but her parents would have been so angry with her. And she got a degree from the LSE in 1913. She was clearly a very, very bright woman. And lots of her career, I just am in awe 100 years on at what she managed to do with her life. She was extraordinary. And I just hope everyone has someone like that in their family where you just think, if only I could be half as good as she would, I would just be so proud. She was amazing.
Yeah,
I'll
that's
say
so cool.
I am in awe of that, because I'm in year 2, and obviously we get to pick our modules in year 2, and I'm taking what we call gender and global politics. So that was quite a touching personal story. Going back to party politics, which is 2019 was where I last saw you face to face, and it was People Don't Know It Party Conference, which was then in Bournemouth. And I remember on the last day, Jo Swinson was giving like her party leader speech, as they usually do. And the one thing I remember quite clearly from that speech is because it was after the successful bounce after the European parliamentary elections. Like the Lib Dems were gaining members left, right, and centre. And she asked everybody who were first-time members or new Lib Dem members to stand up in that audience. And if I remember, there was well over half the audience on final day that were new members. So for you as party president then, how rewarding did that feel, seeing so many new members at party conference?
I mean, it was amazing, Sadie. And the point I'm going to make is not about the Lib Dems. Politics is a rough old game, and you go up and you go down. And that year was just extraordinary. And then everything just fell over. And I think for me, it was probably when Nigel Farage announced that his party were not going to stand. And as a result, that meant that a lot of their voters went just straight back to the Tories. And our voting system is just not fit for purpose in the 21st century world of politics. That we don't exist in a two-party system, or in Scotland even in a 3 or 4 party system. It's really difficult to be able to actually get the numbers that reflect the votes that you get in the country. So it won't surprise you to know that I am part of the Make Votes Matter coalition. I've been fighting for PR for many, many years. And that I work cross-party with. I mean, it's very, very important that we influence people in all parties to try and make your votes count. It's not about my party and getting seats. It's making sure that people feel that their votes count. And if my party gets it wrong and does badly, then we have to regroup, we have to come back, we have to learn to communicate again. Same's true for any party, absolutely any party. But it is still thrilling, and it is good when you're on the up. It's less good when things aren't working.
Well, say the same things weren't working obviously in the general election. Jo Swinson lost her seat, but if my math is really bad, but I think we did gain 3. Well, obviously one was in an already Lib Dem seat, but we had 3 new faces in the Lib Dem team, being Twickenham, St Albans, and North East Fife. So how did that feel, gaining North East Fife, especially off the SNP? And I'm not really sure who St Albans was gained off, because I know that campaign went hell for leather to get Daisy Cooper elected. So
again, I mean, we won North East Fife, but we had held it in the past. We'd lost it 2 elections before that, I think. But I was proudest of those 3 women coming into Parliament, because 2 of them and 2 of the others in our parliamentary party have been part of my leadership training group for high-flying candidates. And to see most of our women, all of them bar one, who is Wendy Chamberlain, who's the MP for North East Fife, because she only won her seat very latterly, come through the party system to support its candidates, not just women. We had 4 protected characteristics: women, disabled, LGBT, and BAME candidates all had this rapid support training, help with their selection processes. And we also found them a business mentor, because we wanted them to have someone from outside making them think about their own leadership qualities. So to see so many of them in Parliament now is really reassuring. I wish we had more MPs, but you know, at least we've got some really, really good young women in Parliament, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah, even though I'm no longer a Lib Dem member focusing on my degree, I totally agree with that. Then Megan, do you want to ask the next question, since I've asked some more follow-ons?
Yeah, I just wondered if you think that female politicians have like different struggles, more struggles than their male counterparts? And if so, have you experienced any because of you being a woman?
I'm afraid I have, and I'm afraid it continues. And part of the general approach of political party members, not political party hierarchy, is their perception that an MP looks like a man in a suit. And a lot of women find they can't get past that first barrier of either the selection committee in a constituency or a hustings in a constituency, which is one of the reasons that along with Labour, we brought in some all-women seats and we made sure that there were always women on the shortlist. Those rules remain very important to us. But when I first stood for Westminster, I was asked at a hustings how my husband was going to cope with my then 3 school-aged children if I was out knocking on doors every night. To which I said, doing pretty well at the moment. And frankly, I've been a councillor for the last 5 years. But the person who asked me that question was female.
Wow.
Was female. And it was because of, and actually quite a lot older than I was, but it is part of this view about an MP mustn't have attachments, has to be free to live in London, and therefore who fulfills the caring responsibilities. So that's been one of the big things I've tried to change within the party. And we now insist that all our selection committees, shortlisting committees, are fully trained in all diversity aspects, because it's not just about women, it's about LGBT candidates, it's about BME candidates, and above all, it's about disabled candidates, which is why the law is different. You are allowed all disabled shortlists by law because there are so few disabled MPs, visible or invisible disabilities. Absolutely appallingly low.
It's interesting because we don't get much press about that in the media. There's quite often they talk about, you know, the lack of BAME MPs or lack of female MPs, and it'd be good if we could get more media coverage on that, because I think if more people knew that that was a problem, maybe something could be done about that.
We do, and the SNP have now started to do the same as us on disabled candidates, which is really good. I think Plaid have as well. The Greens were talking about it, but I don't know how far they've got. But it is a real problem. But there is a bigger problem, and I quite often use a wheelchair. I've got space in the Lords. There's no wheelchair space in the Commons.
That's so bad.
You cannot sit in the Commons in a wheelchair. And so people like Robert Halfon, the brilliant chair of the Education Select Committee, uses either a chair or support, but he has to use sticks to get in and sit down in the chamber because there is nowhere for him.
It's shocking because you look at Parliament to kind of be an example for all employers, for everybody on their day-to-day life, and if they're not even leading by example, I mean, how can they question the rest of society? It's really shocking, really shocking.
It is really shocking. Yeah.
It's amazing that we have got people like you, though, in Parliament that are trying to change this and trying to give these people more of a voice than they currently have. And it's super important that we have got people like you.
And we do gang up together.
Exactly.
In a good campaigning way.
Exactly. It's brilliant. Well done. Thank you for all of that. Amazing.
Ryan?
If you don't mind asking, just because, I mean, we've talked about the inaccessibility of politics. I was wondering if you had anything to say about the barriers put in place by people's socioeconomic backgrounds.
I'd love that to be an extension of those 4 protected characteristics for giving parties being able to give special help to people from socioeconomic backgrounds where we always talk about, are you the first person in your family to go to university? Well, why don't we say, are you the first person in your family to ever think about standing for politics? And actually, it would be good if we can do that, because Parliament will not be a true Parliament until it represents all the people. And it's too much of an old boys, choose the word advisedly, club still.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Megan touched upon a moment ago, that kind of Parliament we should really be looking to Parliament to kind of represent the country. And yeah.
Absolutely. Sorry, there isn't anything else to say. You're right.
Yeah, I'll say I totally agree, and I've had many people say that to me. But going back on what Ryan just said about socio-economics, obviously with the elections being postponed last year, a number of candidates, not just from the Lib Dems, but all parties, have stood down. So if you were in charge of, well, I know you're in charge of the Lib Dems when people like Siobhan Benita, I know I'm not going to say names, but that is the most popular name that came to mind, had to stand down. And a lot of people have mentioned money, but she's a civil servant. So why should someone like her have to be put out of a position that she really wanted to keep and run for her? Like in Bristol, we had a brilliant candidate in Mary Page. She also had to stand down for a number of reasons. It seemed to have all been women that have had to stand down due to the delay in the election. So what would you say to that, or how would you encourage them now that they've had to make the decision to stand down?
It's not just women, but it is mainly women. And standing for Parliament or for a major role, so it could be an elected mayor in a region, is an expensive business. And one of the things that the Conservatives do really well, but I know that other parties have issues with this, is helping such candidates to raise money to support themselves whilst they are a candidate. If you're in a party that hasn't got much money, you can't give the money to the candidate to live, because that's the money you would have spent on their campaign. You just don't have that capacity to do both. So again, one of the things we did in our leadership campaign was to make sure that we taught our candidates how to raise money to support themselves and raise money for their campaign. And if they found it really difficult, to find someone who could do it for them and work with them. So they had to find them because they had to build up that relationship. And that's beginning to sound very much like American politics. And for me, there's a boundary. I mean, I'm fascinated by American politics and watched the election very carefully last year, which will be in lots of books published about very shortly. But because there is virtually no holding back on what people can spend, and the way the tax structures work, it's very easy to raise money from people. We just don't have the same luxury in this country. But I really do worry that we shouldn't end up in a position where people with money win elections. We have to find another way of doing it. Or we're back to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, about people from backgrounds that don't have lots of money or access to the right people won't get elected. So again, one of my party's asks has been better control of how much money is spent during an election, because that's really, really important.
Well, so I totally agree with that, because I know, I say for those who don't know, like during the presidency election, it was I was obviously working on one of the campaign teams, but obviously for Christine Jardine, and obviously her being an MP, people probably would have seen that she had money behind her, but yeah, we had to do a lot of fundraising for the campaigns. We were traveling the length and breadth of the country. It was incredible. I see the fundraising efforts, not just from our camp, but from the eventual winner Mark Pack's camp as well. But do you think people, as you say, people should have to put their own personal income, especially someone like Christine, who's an MP, into maybe in another election fund that they're involved with? I personally, I don't think they should.
I mean, I think in terms of income for people, I managed because I was allowed to go part-time at work for the year run up to an election, or in fact it was 6 months run up to an election. So I made it work, and then I went on leave for the election itself. But I was in a fortunate position that I was in a fairly senior job, and then I had enough money that I was able to save money to do it. But I think we have to find other ways of doing it. The best way of doing it is to build up a team around the candidate who can take a lot of the load of the work off, so that candidate can continue working even if it's on a part-time basis. But you've got to have local parties. This is not a Lib Dem thing. This is just across the board. You've got to have local parties who don't just think they're electing a candidate who's going to do everything on their own. You need to understand that you're only going to win the seat to be an MP if you've got a team working together. Or even if you're not going to win it this time, you might win it next time, and your target is to get into a good second place. Be very clear about your objectives, build up your support team to make sure that that happens.
Yeah, I say you're building a good team. I say the university is in one of the top marginal seats in the country, Filton and Bradley Stoke. I know where the Lib Dems increased their vote share, and the top three parties, the Tories, Labour and the Lib Dems, all have really good teams behind. I know I shouldn't be praising the Tories, but they, I'm not going to lie, they do have quite good campaigning teams behind them. So I'm going to pass it over to Meg now for probably the last set of questions now to come into the top of the hour. So Meg, take it away.
I'm muted, sorry, I did not realise that. For my last question, I just wanted to ask like what your advice would be either to your younger self or to people like us who are studying politics, maybe people are considering going into politics, what your advice would be for them?
It's very simple. It's get stuck in.
Yeah.
Absolutely get stuck in. And whilst you are young, there is no problem with going and tasting the different parties. So get involved. I think I'd say don't just do it through your university societies, do it at home as well, because from my experience, both having been a student a long time ago, but also working in universities, the way student politics operates is actually very different to the way politics happens in a constituency that's got a broader issue. And stand, please stand. Find out how to stand for council. If you aren't quite sure if it's for you, then stand in a seat where you know you're not going to win, but you're helping the party and you'll learn some skills. Also, go and work on by-election campaigns to really see what the excitement of a by-election is like. I mean, there is nothing like the buzz of a by-election. I'm afraid I'm a complete by-election junkie. I've got stickers. I've got so many stickers. I've now been told to take them down from where I keep them on my mirror in the bedroom. I've got had lines of stickers. I have actually taken them down because I've just loved, it's rather like party conference. If you're a member of a party, you go to conference to meet people who share your values, share your political aspirations. You go to by-elections, it's because you're trying to put that into action and help win a seat. And for many people, they won't be able to win their local seat. This is the way you can make a difference. And then you'll really find out if politics is for you. And I just, hope you enjoy it.
Following on from that, do you think young people should be careful about the groups that they do join, that maybe if they're a bit extreme left or extreme right, that maybe they might not be taken so seriously when they go into politics, or that could be used against them? Because I hear a lot of people saying that, like, let's say Momentum, they're nervous to join Momentum in case that's seen negatively in the future, in groups like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, look, you're students and you're doing an arts subject. You know how to use your critical thinking.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to think carefully about what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think at your age, if you're going around, and at the moment that seems really exciting and the right thing, then get in and get involved. If after a while you realize it's not quite for you or it's too extreme, then recognize that and move on to what you do want to do. I, as president of the party, welcome plenty of people who came in from other parties, who said, I would never, ever, ever have dreamed that I would be joining the Liberal Democrats, but I believe in what you're doing now. Yeah. And I've seen people leave the Lib Dems and, never again will I ever do anything with you. That's okay. You can't, political parties are not going to be perfect for everyone all the time. Yeah. I think the key thing at the moment for you, especially while you're studying politics, is to get out there and see what's happening on the ground, because it is exciting. I can remember my first proper campaign in '76, getting out there, going up tower blocks in Paddington, delivering leaflets in the Greater London elections, which may sound awful, but we met at the pub afterwards. We talked politics long into the evening. It was really fantastic, and I absolutely loved it, and I've just got more and more hooked.
Amazing. Thank you. That's really answered my question. So thank you so much.
For the last question, it's maybe a divisive question, but it's a fun one. Just I wondered, do you have a kind of former or perhaps the present member of the leader of the Lib Dems that you kind of identify with most?
Ooh, that's interesting. Yes, we identify with as in support, who or see myself as someone in the same mould.
I'd say support.
Support. Okay. Well, there's two who were absolutely opposite, but I loved working with both of them. One was Paddy Ashdown and the other was Charles Kennedy. And they were absolutely, totally different characters. But I had the privilege to get to know both of them really well and campaign with them. And in completely different ways, they were really wonderful politicians. Paddy Ashdown, ex-soldier, his heart was liberal, but his head was a campaigner, and what's more, it was in the style of the military, and he got things done. Charles was probably the most thoughtful politician I've ever come across in my life. Absolutely quite extraordinary and a brilliant communicator, and that really showed through for most of his life, sadly, in his last 2 or 3 years when he was very, very unwell. Perhaps it didn't, but it was a pleasure working for both of them. And they both did very courageous things as well as leaders. I mean, I can remember Charles's decision to oppose the Iraq War, which you will not remember because you are far, far too young, or you weren't around even. But we were hounded in the press and by the two major parties for being utterly disloyal to our country. And yet, Charles said, we cannot support this. We just cannot support this. And at the time when he first did that, I mean, he said to a number of us, I think that's my career absolutely dead. Because if it's the right thing to have done, gone into that war, then I'm toast. But he was right. It wasn't a good thing to do. And we're still reaping the whirlwind of that war now, I'm afraid, in the Middle East.
Yeah. Wow.
Well,
Yeah, I guess he stood the test of time there.
Mm.
Thank you so much for coming. It's an absolute pleasure hearing you speak.
yeah, I really agree with both of that, because obviously Paddy being MP in Yeovil is obviously a couple of doors constituencies away from me. I'd always remember people talking about Paddy and how great he is. They still do in Somerset. And then I met his wife Jenny at conference. She is such a lovely character. And Charles Kennedy, not many people know this, but I share my birthday with him.
Oh,
Yes, 25th of November. I've told everybody this. And I think that's why I identified with the Lib Dems a lot. But yeah, so thanks, Al, for coming. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your evening after such a busy day, which I know it has been for you.
well,
So,
thank you for asking me. I've enjoyed it. And take care and do politics. Do politics.
we will. Thanks so much.